Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to Bitcoin and the Bible. This is week number 4, and this week is going to be a little bit more in depth, not in Bitcoin itself, but more in the walk of the Christian faith. More about what the Christian faith says about our government, about our finances, obviously, but about our tithing and about laws and rules and giving. A lot of what we'll talk about today is going to be specifically through the Bible, but more or less it is both the Old Testament and the New Testament kind of coming together. And there is a glimpse of like theology through some of this as well. And not every element here is going to connect directly to Bitcoin. A lot of this is just focused on Jesus. And that's the purpose of me doing this talk, is to spread the good news of Christ. Secondarily, it is to talk about a money that cannot be stolen from you, and one that I think that churches should be utilizing to gain that freedom. And so I'm not the most qualified person to talk about this, probably. I'm just doing what God's asked me to do, and just continuing in what His word says, and through that, gaining an understanding of how we can internalize that for ourselves and take an individualistic approach for our own money, but for our own faith. And by placing that in the right thing. So I want to just preface again, the podcast that we go over here, I'm really giving you a summary of what these podcasts are. And in order to gain the most out of them, I highly encourage you to go and watch those and listen to those for yourself, because they do a fantastic job breaking down each of these elements, where I can just give a highlight or cliff note kind of version to that with my own takes along the way. So with that being said, this talk is going to be based on episodes number 13 through 16, and it starts with episode 13, Does the Government Own Money? And they pose two main questions in the beginning of this podcast, which is, what if my government bans Bitcoin? And what if my government changes its tax code on Bitcoin? And I think the reason that they go over these two questions and kind of stop there is because when this podcast was done in 2021, there was a lot of undecided regulation or undecided taxation. It was kind of like a moving target for what Bitcoin could be or was going to be. And we have a lot more of a definition of that now, with our government creating a Bitcoin strategic reserve and not doing either of those things, but more or less accepting Bitcoin and seeing it as an asset without an issuer. So to start off, we'll start with 1 Peter 2:13 through 17. It says, "Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority." It continues in 17 and says, It is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live freely as people, and do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves." And God's word here is sufficient for everything that we're going to talk about today, but it allows us to have a proper worldview even for hard questions. To submit yourself to every human authority is to say that you submit yourself to the authorities of the government. And while this isn't my favorite talk by any means, I do want to just consider the moral case for Bitcoin in this scenario. And that it doesn't mean that you need to be all in on the government or you need to be all in on Bitcoin. That we should live for Him, and that we should be guiding our life through what Christ says that we should do. But by living out the truths that we've discovered, which is the financial system that we're currently in and how Bitcoin changes that system, we can believe that Christ will be glorified by our actions and that he will take care of us for our future. God obviously instituted governments. He talks about it quite a bit, and it's a necessary part of his work. God is glorified whenever Christians submit themselves to the government or the authorities that are above them, even if they're unjust authorities. Many Christians do have to live under tyrannical governments, and they still seek God's provision during these hard times. And that's the main focus of the Christian faith, is even if you are going through something that's difficult in your jurisdiction or in your government, that we can be guaranteed it will be hard for someone somewhere until Christ returns and makes things whole again. The government is not a solution to the evils of the world. Even the judges and three-branch system or constitution that we've come to know, they are not going to clean up all of the evil in the world. Only God can remedy these wrongdoings. And while governments have seized control over money or over dollars, individual choice is ultimately what drives the best money or the money for the society. It comes down to a determination of what people want to use. Governments do not own money because everything is given to us by God, and individuals inherit that secondary sovereignty that God allows us to have. We talked a lot about that secondary sovereignty last week. God gives us everything. He gives us life. He provides us with work. He gives us money to use, and from God, it is a personal right to work and to own your time, to own your life. In short, person-to-person slavery is not of God. Like it read in 1 Peter 2:13, it said, live as God's slaves. It was 17, not 13. But to continue, Deuteronomy 24:6 says, do not seize a handmill or an upper millstone as collateral for a loan. You'd be seizing someone's very life. So you can see this connection between the two. The millstone that they're referring to here is the top part of a grain like grinder, or the hand mill is like what you use to grind grains down into flour, just the basics of making bread. And so it says you'd be seizing someone's very life, meaning that by taking even physical items or things from them that they're using in their work, that they're using to produce with, that this is not of God. Governments, however, have an authority over that we have allowed them or given them. And even though the Bible talks about it, the government, as having a limited authority, as Christians, that limited authority can be overstepped if the government, if their command is to be in direct violation with the commandments of God. For instance, a Christian should have the authority to preach the Word of God no matter the jurisdiction or the legality of it. And we're very grateful to live in the United States where you have freedom of speech and you can do that here. However, it's seemingly becoming harder in other countries, even developed countries, to speak your mind and say what you would like without having to come under this scrutiny. And the ultimate foundation of the government was to instantiate property rights, to allow people to own property, but then ultimately for that to be enforced, that if someone's property was violated, that the government would step in and would help in that way to get the property to the rightful owner. To go a step further, it's to say that when God created, the government, it was necessarily the church. It was a collection of people that were looking out for people, and that was the premise of the entire thing. But God does not instantiate money. He does not allow governments this authority. He talks specifically about what kind of fabric people are to wear, but not specifically what money to use. He talks about worship and how we should worship, but it's still our individual decision on whether or not we will worship him or not. God, again, he owns everything. And if he wanted governments to own the money, he would have said so, but he does not describe it in this way. We need to remember too that, again, the church was the government, and that there was a very close tie between the rightful things to do in the society and the way that God was moving forward. And that there was not necessarily a law against not tithing to the church, but there was laws against not paying your taxes. So these are very different things. I feel like there's a disconnect between tithing and taxes, that somehow this line was almost kind of blurred in some way. Because it comes down to individual choice. It comes down to individual worship. You can choose whether or not to pay your taxes. You can choose whether or not to tithe. However, governments weren't always the church. There were bigger governments that were not instantiated on the foundational principles of God. And you had governments like Egypt. Governments like Egypt described that silver was money and that it could be exchanged for grain. That was one of the biggest trade areas for grain was in Egypt. And it was because of their resources and their people. In Genesis 47:13 through 16, it says, people valued food more than money. So they sold their silver, livestock, and eventually themselves to Egypt for exchange of food, because the government controlled everything, money and food. When they leave, when they leave Egypt in Exodus later on down the road, once they have sold themselves for food or sold all their money for food, they actually take back the gold and the silver from the Egyptians and leave and head to the promised land with Moses. In Samuel 8:8, it says, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing this to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know that what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Saying that in reference to Egypt, that when people are free to make decisions, they ultimately decide on having a king rule over them. And this is what they're trying to describe here in Samuel, 1 Samuel, is that the people became confused to the fact that they did not need a king. And it was being written that if they were to instantiate this, they were to say like, hey, so-and-so is our king, that he would claim them as his right and start to take from the people again. You can't give life, property, or money to the government and think to yourself that the government is going to have your best interest at heart, because we're told from the story in the Bible that they won't. It's It's inevitable that they won't. It's written that way. Samuel told all of the words to the Lord, to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you. He will claim you as his right. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some will assign and be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others will plow his ground and reap his harvest. And still others make wars of weapon of wars and equipment for his chariots. He will even take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive gardens and give them over to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendees. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take and use for his own. He will take a tenth of your flocks. You and yourself will be slaves. When the day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." Even great kings, King David, King Solomon, they're fallible men. They fell to this fault as well. And a central government that we're under today has essentially seized all of the money and has tricked us to thinking that we're working for ourselves whenever we're not. And you can see through history that whenever one, king takes over a people, a larger king can just come in and take over that as well. Money, however, it was chosen through the free market. It was coinage that changed that and made it a government instantiated currency. And coinage was introduced to finance wars. It was created to debase currencies and expand government control. To connect this to Bitcoin and help you see why I'm talking through all of this is because Bitcoin does not have these flaws. It cannot be debased. It cannot be inflated. It can't be confiscated, and it's difficult to centralize. Especially if everyone watching this goes out and purchases a little bit, you are helping decentralize the asset. You are helping to not allow them to just keep it in one area and have control over its use. Governments, by debasing currency, are effectively stealing wealth from people in order to finance their own doings. Look at Franklin Roosevelt with the Executive Order 6102. He made gold illegal. He told the population that they had to turn in their gold into the government because of the Great Depression and because of World War I. Now, as soon as he took the gold from everyone, he revalued it and said that it's worth more as soon as he had it. He had to pay people back that original amount because he got sued, but it's still, you couldn't verify that every single person got what they deserved. He made it illegal. Look at President Nixon. He closed the gold window entirely in 1972, which was a detachment from the gold standard and allowed them to finance the Vietnam War. Taxation, however, in the Mosaic Law, it does not specify the amount of taxation that we have today. We don't see some specific taxes in the Bible compared to what we have today. For instance, we don't see income tax, sales tax, or property tax, or capital gains tax. These are all new inventions that have been created in our lifetime that have started to steal the wealth from people. And from the government, we don't see deficit spending. We don't see central banking. We don't see wealth redistribution. We don't see centralized interest rate setting or currency debasement. These things, again, are created in our daily life today. And they're created because we've given the power of money over to the government. And these things that I just said, all of them corrupt and distort the signal that's in the marketplace. They only allow it to benefit the ones at the top. If there was a proper setup to help those in need, you would have something that looks like how it does in the Bible. They said, don't glean your fields to the edges. Don't go over your trees twice. Leave some for the needy. Leave some for the poor. And as Christians, we can begin to understand how that can help others, how we can do the same thing. And it comes down to work. The poor still had to work. The needy still had to work. And it's something that is a gift from God. Again, He allows us to work, and He allows us the freedoms to give. And as Christians, we should be open and ready to do that at a moment's notice. In Romans 13, 1-7, it says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. Again, there it is that we need to submit to the governing authorities. But there is no authority except that which God has established. It says, the authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, which means along with that, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do will bring judgment on themselves. In verse 3, it says, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. There it is. That God is showing us that governments are supposed, the authority is supposed to be God's servant for our good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment to the wrongdoers. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This call has limitations. The limitations on the government, which is to say that rulers hold no terror for those who do right, and only for those who do wrong. Those who are obeying God should not have to have any fear in the government, because the government was ordained by God and are servants to the people to protect them. And it's funny, we completely forget about this term that government workers, government officials are supposed to be public servants. And I feel like we've lost that because we've given them so much power and so much authority that now they've overstepped what it says in the Bible, and they're doing terror on even to those that are doing good. When the government does overstep this authority, I guess I would simply ask, why give the government the taxation whenever we can give that to our churches in a different form, in a different way, that has different properties, right? Because they've instantiated that they own the money, they own the dollars, right? But no one owns the Bitcoin until you put it in your possession, then it becomes individual property. And so why should a government receive more than God? If a tithe is 10% of our wealth, and we're being taxed at 20, 30, sometimes 40% on top of that, that's essentially what we're communicating. And there is this verse in the Bible that says, render to Caesar's what is Caesar's. I don't have the verse number right in front of me, but I just want to kind of change that sentence a little bit and say, render to Washington what is Washington's, okay? There's no picture of anyone on the front of Bitcoin. Even Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, is not in control of the network. It's the free market that has selected this as money, and it allows it to continue to work through innovation, through running nodes, and through ultimately no enforcement. It's a free choice. And Bitcoin doesn't need to be protected from outside forces. Therefore, it doesn't need to be taxed, right? Like, they're not providing any additional security on the network. And that should very simply just start to show you that there shouldn't be any taxation on this asset. The transaction fees themselves are inherently the part of the network that is the taxation, if you want to call it that, because that's what's protecting the network through proof of work. And really, it's important to come down to the brass tacks of it, and it's to say, no pun intended, it's to say that God is sovereign, and he's sovereign over oppressive governments. So ultimately, our hope is not in Bitcoin, our hope is in God. And by placing our hope in the right thing, and by allowing ourselves to have the knowledge and wisdom that we can use something different as a form of money, we can begin to build a foundation that allows us to have the future that God would like for our churches, for our faith. In episode 14, it starts to talk about the temptation, however, of owning Bitcoin, and how with a finite asset of only 21 million, once you understand that, you can start to see that there's only so much. You can really start to make that your focus. There is a way out of this illusion of protection, and that is through generosity. God himself is generous with us, enabling us to be less attached to money by being more generous with others, showing his love. He gifted us with the best gift, Jesus Christ, and through the ultimate gift of eternal life with him. That generosity extends to us in a physical way as well, where we can then take that and be generous with others by spreading the good news of the gospel, or by, at the least, being diligent with our tithes and our offerings for the needy and the poor. This even is encompassed in 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19, where it says, "Instruct those who are rich in this present world to not be conceited or fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all the things we enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves a treasure, a good foundation for the future, so that they can take hold of that which is needed in life indeed." And this is, again, kind of we need to weigh these two things and not just compare them side by side. We need to be able to look at being generous with our time and being generous to others with our gifts, but also generous with our money. And that wisdom is superior to the wealth. In other words, it's as valuable as wealth. Being generous with our time, being generous sitting down with someone and talking with them and helping them understand, not Bitcoin, Jesus, and helping them understand the purpose of life and getting an understanding of the reality that they're going through and their creator and who made them. God would desire for us to choose that wisdom before we go choose Bitcoin. That's not the purpose here. It's being generous with who we are as people and how we can help them find freedom, not just financial freedom, to find freedom in their life, freedom from their job, freedom from their stress, freedom from their fear. And Christ is the one who does that. Proverbs 8:10 and 11 says, "Take my instruction and not silver, and knowledge rather than the choice of gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all desirable things cannot compare with her." Proverbs 19:1 says, "Better is a poor man who walks with his integrity, better is a poor man who walks with his integrity than he who is perverse in speech and is a fool. It's better to have wisdom. And God is wisdom. He owns it. God instills that wisdom into Christ. And by knowing Christ, by being more like Christ, we can get the best thing imaginable. The instruction here is to buy wisdom and do not sell it, which we can very easily insert buy Bitcoin and do not sell it. But we need to be sure that we have the correct framework for money, that we're putting it in the right place and putting our Savior first. Obviously, it says the love of money is still the root of all evil. In Proverbs 20:13, it says, "Do not love sleep or you will become poor. Open your eyes and you will be satisfied with food." This wealth, you heard the term health is wealth. And that's the reason this verse is in here, is to help you see that if you sleep all day and you're stagnant in life, it's not healthy. You're not wealthy. If you have your eyes closed and you're just scarfing down food, you're not satisfied. You're blind to the reality of what food can do for you. And that wealth comes from Him. The food comes from Him. The wisdom comes from Him. It all comes back to this concept of putting the right thing first, so then the next following thing is correct. It's in the right order. And this might not be money is the next right thing. It's probably people is the next right thing. In Proverbs 10:22, it says, "It's a blessing of the Lord that makes you rich. He adds no sorrow to it." Or Proverbs 8:18 says, "Riches and honor are with me, enduring wealth and righteousness." A wise man who works hard and builds up an inheritance and leaves it with his offspring is to be commended. It is God, though, that puts the hard work to be able to accumulate that wealth. The hard work of opening your eyes to the food you're eating and the time you're spending in bed or sitting around watching Netflix or whatever. It's the Lord that puts that hard work in front of us. That can seem overwhelming, but God does value peace more than He values wealth. This is because with wealth, it can feel like there's just no limits. If you have all the money saved in the world, you can go do anything or be anyone or take as many vacations you want. But there are limits. And we ultimately need to be able to count on something more than wealth, something with unlimited potential, with unlimited power in Jesus. Because okay, I'm just going to read this. 2 Corinthians 8:9 says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though He was rich, yet for your sake He became poor, so that you, through His poverty, might become rich." This, again, is not talking about rich in money, rich in value, rich in things. This is talking about rich in life. We live in this distorted reality where we see, a great sin accompanied by great wealth. It's time that we begin to look at the people of God as wealthy and as blessed by Him. God did not intend for us to look at people who are wealthy and say, well, who did they steal from to get that? Instead, we need to be looking at people and ask, what did they do to allow God to bless them in that way? Because that's where it comes from. That's ultimately the whole purpose of this, is to see that, these pitfalls that we could fall into, God warns us about, which is like coveting. That, the story of the person who says, my grain silos are full, I'm going to tear them down and build bigger ones so that way I can store even more. this concept, it's overruled by what God says, because he says, "You fool, don't you know that your very life is going to be taken from you tonight?" Hoarding is not the way that God intended for us to live. And the way out of this mindset is through generosity. He wants us to be like him in that way. And that's the whole reason I'm doing this lesson, is being generous with my time and being generous with I could be at home right now with my family. It's a nice day outside. Withholding, though, from God is another pitfall. It says in the Bible, "Bring the whole tithe to the storehouse." It's easy for us to say, what's mine is mine, and he provided it to me, so I'm going to keep it. But we are to bring an offering. The thing that God says here about this offering is that we can test him with it. See if God doesn't open up the heavens and pour out blessing for you when you are generous. We need to drop our time preference. We've talked a lot about that time preference element through basically every week. But we need to be generous today because tomorrow is not promised. Be careful of another pitfall here, which is greediness, right? To try to safeguard ourselves against these get-rich-quick schemes. I think about altcoins in the system where we see them going up, at an exponential rate, or can try to want to put our cash in, fast-moving companies, so that way we can gain the system, or gain more than someone else. It says in the Bible that those who labor earnestly will prosper. Proverbs 21:5 echoes this and says, "The plans of the diligence certainly lead to profit. Anyone who is reckless will become poor." And there's a joke in Bitcoin that says, if you want more Bitcoin, just go sell your chairs, because you can only sit on one chair at a time. So why do you have 10, 12 chairs in your house whenever you just need one? And I would add to this, if you want more Bitcoin, don't leverage your house. Don't bet the farm, right? Proverbs 21:17 says that the one who loves pleasure will become a poor man. Whoever loves wine and oil will not get rich. Remember, this is all his. The work, the money, all of it. Galatians 6:10 says, "So then, while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those in the household of faith." And that's to be generous with our church body, to be generous with people that we can reach. We say at our church, generosity is a privilege that's not kept secret. That's not a privilege you don't keep secret. It's to be used today. Along with this truth, we must remember that it's not just the giving that allows us to be free from these pitfalls of greed, of like withholding or coveting. It's a heart motion that goes along with it. This is a rejoice in giving. Proverbs 19 frames it and says, "The one who is gracious to a poor man lends the Lord, and he will repay him for his good deed." Just this idea that God is calling us to be generous to the poor. Giving is not about convenience. It's supposed to be hard. And once you understand, again, that there's only 21 million Bitcoin and that you've been saving in this for a while, and ultimately now I'm encouraging that you need to be generous in order to not fall into these pitfalls, and you need to be generous with a happy heart and with joy, that it becomes really, really hard because you can always go out and obtain more dollars. You can't do that with Bitcoin. 1 Timothy 6 says in verse 6, "But godliness is actually a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering with these, we shall be content. But with those who want to get rich, they fall into temptation and a snare, and many fools and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and perceived themselves with many griefs. No amount of money is going to make you content. This sacrificial giving, this joyful heart giving that I'm talking about here, is the antidote to greed. No matter if you have 5 Bitcoin or a tenth of a Bitcoin, you can be sacrificially generous with what you have. This isn't about a specific amount. This is about a change of your mind and a change of your heart. In 2 Corinthians 9, it says, "Now I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must do it as he has a purpose in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that you always have sufficiency in everything. You may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, he scattered abroad and gave to the poor. His righteousness endures forever." This verse can sound at first like, oh, if I give a lot, I'm going to reap a lot. If I give a little, I'm just going to get a little. But this is more than giving. This is about the proportional giving that you have, that God's instilled you with. It's different for everyone. Like I said, if you have 5 Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or whatever, it's proportional to you. What's giving a lot to you might be giving a little to someone else. And that's because of what God allows us to manage, right? But he will provide for you. He'll provide the work. He'll provide the house. He'll provide the food. He'll take away the fear. He'll take away the uncertainty. He'll take away the doubt. And this is why I believe that this connects properly to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin allows you to be more generous. Not only because the asset is finite and that the value of it in dollars will go up over time, but that it allows you to start living within your means and teaches you that foundational principle so that we can start to make the right decisions with our ability. And we can always have a plan for giving. We could have a plan for giving in dollars. We could have a plan for giving our property. But you need that plan no matter what. You need to be ready to give. You need to be on the lookout how you can help the needy. Have a legacy plan. Today I'm doing this video in the legacy room at our church. And it's important for you to have that legacy plan, because if you just have an idea to just leave your family with a bunch of wealth that you've accumulated, they could squander it if you're not teaching them the principles, the understanding of why it's this money and how to use it and what to use it for. We use the money that God obviously has allowed us to save in, and we have to be content with what we have. This goes back to the time preference piece, where another saying in Bitcoin is everyone buys Bitcoin at the price they deserve. But if everyone buys it at the price they deserve and someone is just receiving it for free, blindly, without any teaching, without any lesson behind it, it ultimately needs to support the work that others have done to accumulate it so that it's not squandered. Take the understanding and the wisdom and knowledge and take that and be generous with it as well. Because hoarding ultimately comes down to both money and knowledge. And if these are gifts from God, we need to be generous with all of it. This next episode is titled New Testament Money Matters. And so far through a lot of these talks, we've taken a look at the Old Testament and what the Old Testament says about money. But now it's time to take a look at what Jesus says about money. And while I can't go through every single time that Jesus talks about money, he does talk a lot about money, but it is secondary to the kingdom. And I'm not here to dispel every single time that he talks about money and compare it to Bitcoin in that way. Again, the goal is to understand what the Old Testament says and what the New Testament says about money, and hold both of these in our mind at the same time so that we can understand the gift, the reason that God allows us to use it. You can't serve both God and money. Luke 16:13-14 says, "No servant can serve two masters, for he will either hate one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other." And there's the sentence, you cannot serve God and wealth. So what's going on here? Jesus is warning us and warning his disciples about dividing their loyalty between this age, this living, breathing life we have, and the next life that we have. You must love the Lord with all your heart, not money. He's trying to show us that we need to put him first. That a devotion to money is reflective of someone who is not in submission to God. As Christians, we need to be clear that we're not money driven. And that's the whole purpose of this talk, is like, the reason I'm doing this series is because the name of it's Bitcoin in the Bible, but I wish it was flipped so much. It was Bible and Bitcoin, because we've got to put the first thing first. Because to be a lover of money is not a characteristic of, this last day that you'll spend on earth. It's in rebellion to what God and Christ are going to return and judge for. We need to be sure that we're not anxiously driven towards money. And we need to understand again that God allows us to have it. Hebrews 13:5 says, "Make sure that your character is free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you." This is about a characterization of our heart. Money is not to dominate our mind. Full satisfaction can only be found in Christ. And if you do not have a home church, I would encourage you massively to visit a few. If you've never been to church, go to a couple, search around, look for look for your congregation, the type of people that you can be around and that inspire you and that will show you Christ's love. We need to be sure that Bitcoin does not dominate our whole life. As much as it might be a major piece, as much as it might seem like a new solution that can solve things, it allows us freedom to not worry about money, but our lives need to be built on Christ. Luke 9:25 says, "For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself?" This is not about the pursuit of Bitcoin. This is not about, I said in one of the prior videos, and maybe I should tone it back a little bit, which is, this is about changing the monetary system. As much as that would be amazing and would be really beneficial for humanity, this is about a wisdom of money that puts it in the right place in our life so that we can gain the features and so that it can be used for our benefit, but so that we can glorify God in the process. This is not about the size of your wallet. It's about the condition of your heart and our willingness to give with our life. Luke 6:24 and 25 says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry." This was a conversation to the Pharisees because the Pharisees were trusted with wealth. They had a lot of wealth, and they had to carry that with them. We are too. We're also entrusted to a lot of wealth, and we carry Christ with us and have to teach other people, being sinners ourselves. This fine line is really important because we begin to implement our life that God is the giver of wealth, right? But if we're unable to humble ourselves to the understanding that a wealthy person does not enter the kingdom of heaven. So just like we talked about a second ago, this is about being generous and being able to undo some of the things that maybe have caused us to stumble in the past. This talk to the Pharisees is about helping them see that humility and that generosity needs to be taken in order to understand God's favor. Jesus does also talk about interest and receiving an interest. In Luke 6:34 through 35, it says, "If I lend to those from whom expect to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners in order to receive back the same amount. But love your enemies and do a good deed and lend expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind and grateful, is kind to ungrateful and evil men." If someone borrows from you, right, is Jesus saying here that we need to forget about this concept of interest and receiving back money with interest? I don't think so. But what he's outlining is a clear area where we should be acting a certain way towards enemies. If someone that you loan money to defaults on the loan, we should not be greedy or expect more in return. If we were willing to make the loan, that is a fault of our own, that we can be generous in that way to forgive that person. And God's even saying in this that the reward on the other side is far greater. And that even a sinner will lend out to other sinners if they know they're going to get their money. So it's a tricky one here because there is no lending in Bitcoin. There's not this idea of interest in Bitcoin. There's a funny saying that goes around that says, "Where does the yield come from?" Meaning the interest, the extra. Where does it come from? Because there's only 21 million coins. How would someone be able to get more of that to give to you if they don't go get that from someone else? And this brings up a great point. I mean, because God's saying here, if you're going to lend, expect nothing in return. Just get the same amount back. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Personally, I don't think there's a single thing wrong with that element. The biggest story that I can think of whenever it comes to Jesus and money is whenever he talks about the money changers at the temple. In Mark 11:15 through 17, it says, "On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, 'It is not written, My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Jesus is not necessarily calling money dirty and saying we can't have money in our churches and we can't sell things in our churches. What he's saying here is that in this time, when people would come to the temple, they would have to travel with their money. And when they would get there, they would need to shave off pieces of it for a tithe to the church. However, these money changers, these people selling in the church, were receiving a cut. They were receiving a slice for themselves and essentially stealing the wealth from the people that came to worship God, where that money, that wealth is for the temple, it's for the church, it's an offering. And he's calling out the theft of money, and the theft of money specifically inside of the temple. It's extortion, essentially. He's calling out that people should not be extorting others if they are in the church, if they're part of if they're part of like God's house. Like, for instance, you can expect to have like a slice shaved off if you're at an airport and you're exchanging currencies. Like, that's expected. But this was purely theft. And I think back to one of the episodes we talked about where we talked about the wealth extraction, how whenever you swipe a card, that the merchant has to pay a fee to the card provider. This could be changed in our churches very simply, and we could sell things again, in our churches and not have the Visa network there stealing a little bit of that wealth or taking a little bit for themselves. This is more or less saying that, like, with Bitcoin, if we were to sell, my church has merch. We sell t-shirts and hoodies and stuff. If we were to sell that in Bitcoin, you would pay the value for value. It would be the exact amount that the shirt is worth. It removes that middleman. It removes that, what did he call them? The money changers. It removes them from the church and allows the church to sell directly to the person. There's another instance here that Jesus talks about money, which is the parable of the talents. He says that a wealthy master entrusts 3 of his slaves each with different amounts of money, one with 5, one with 2, and one with 1. He calls them talents, but I think it's referring to money here. And the slave who got 5 talents, whenever the master came back from a trip, he said, "Look, master, I got 5 more." And he said, "Good job. Come on in to my kingdom." And the slave that was given 2 talents returned an additional 2 talents and said, "Look, this is what I was able to do with what you gave me." He said, "Good job. Come on in." And the one guy who had 1 talent got afraid. And he got so afraid that he took his money and he buried it in the ground. And the master says, "You lazy slave, you should have at least put 1 talent in the bank so that I would receive an interest on this arrival." And when you first hear the story, it's almost saying, is this telling us not to use Bitcoin? Because, well, again, there's no interest in Bitcoin. There is no yield that you can get. And no, this passage is referring to our servitude. It's referring to our relationship to fear as well. If God takes care of you, if he takes care of the sparrows, right? He takes care of the flowers, he will take care of you as well. And we don't need to go around worrying about our money. We can act with what we've been given and receive the blessing that God allows us to manage in return. This is huge here. This parable is to make sure that you get your priorities straight and that you're not acting on fear when it comes to money. That God has entrusted us with work and with not just investing. I don't think that investing is the right word. I think that it's more the work that you can do in the marketplace to acquire more for Him is part of it. But I also think whenever I was reading this story for myself, I thought about them as actual talents, like real things that like a person can do. And if a person can do 5 things, that's a lot of different things they could do. Maybe they could do photography, build a website, make videos, be a janitor and taxi driver. That's a lot of things that person can do. So they go out in the marketplace and they work on those things and they come back and they have 5 more things. That makes sense. Person with 2, maybe they can make good food and they can wash dishes. They go out in the marketplace and they do those things and they come back and they have 2 more. And then I think about the person with 1. That fear that the person is, let's say they're really good at digging holes. They're looking at the other talents. They're looking at the other people around them and saying, well, I'm only good at digging holes. So I'm going to dig a hole and put my money in it, and that's going to be where I put it. And they don't go out in the marketplace and do anything with what they've been given. That's what makes them the lazy slave, is that they're not doing the work to be able to get a return on what the master entrusted them with. And you can think about that in our own life. We don't, if we don't use the skills and the tools and the things that God's given us to empower other people, to help other people, we will not be given any in return. I also think about this with actually reaching people. If I come back to Jesus and I say, look, God, I was able to help 5 other people meet you, that's a win. That's a huge win. But if someone goes out and they say, well, I wasn't able to reach anyone. It's just me. You gave me one life. I'm going to bury my life. And then I'm going to say, look, here's my life. I'll give it back to you. It's not, you're not saving anyone in the process. Even just the 1 could go out and make a 1. You can teach what you know to someone else. You can work hard on the things that you know you can do, and you can be of value to someone else. It's knowing that you are valuable and knowing that God has instilled you with 1 talent, a whole talent. Think about that with Bitcoin. He gave you 5 Bitcoin. You going to use them or are you going to keep them still? He gave you 2 Bitcoin. You're going to go out and use them or you're going to just bury them? Even the guy with 1 could do something. He could build something. He could teach someone. There's so many ways that this parable kind of speaks to me. I'm kind of just like spitballing now, but I think that it's really important that we evaluate what we're doing with our life and that we're not just burying it and wanting to come back later and say, here you go, it's right back to you. And that we're not operating that out of fear or comparison. Because to take this back to money, it's not that money fixes our heart. Only God can do that. And so by seeking Him and by doing the work, by acting in good favor, we can do more for Him. That's really the end of number 15. I spitballed a lot of that there at the end. But to move on to number 16, this episode of the podcast is very, very deep and theological. I'm not fully there yet. I don't believe in my ideology with the afterlife or with revelations or with the end times or things like that. So this one might be a little bit shorter to finish us off, but I encourage you, again, go listen to the podcast. You will get a lot out of episode 16. if you have a lot that you are kind of missing on this element here. And it encourages us to zoom out. I love that analogy because you need to zoom out. If you're fixated on the Bitcoin price, zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And they pose this question: what is God's ultimate purpose for his created universe? How does our work and our money today and have a future that fits in God's plan? Men and women were created in God's image, and that means that we are to be working hard over time with wisdom, knowledge, and creativity in collaboration with others. We are to steward the time that we have well. We're to steward the energy that we have every day well. And when we are able to do that, we can live a fulfilled life. But if we just think about the afterlife a little bit, we could start to imagine maybe that, like, heaven is just a place where we're all just sitting around strumming a harp. And I don't think that's the case because of the way God explains giving and worship, and it has work involved, and there will be joy in that work, and you won't get tired from that work. God's kingdom will return to earth, and he will rule over the earth. Daniel 7:14 says, "And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one in which that will not be destroyed." I personally didn't know this before listening to this episode, but when Christ returns, there's 1,000-year kingdom that he will then hand over to his Father for eternity. When his kingdom comes, everyone will know him. Everyone will be forgiven. Isaiah 65:21 through 23 says, "They will build houses and inhabit them. They will also plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not build homes for others to inhabit. They will not plant fruit for others to eat." So it's saying this whole thing of, like, you're going to work and build your house. You're going to work and eat your food. For as the lifetime of a tree, so will be the days of my people, and my chosen ones will wear out the work of their hands. They will not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they are the offspring of the blessed by the Lord, and their descendants with them. Meaning, like, the kingdom talks about work, but it talks about work in a way that says you're not going to get tired from doing it. You're going to have joy in your work. When Christ returns, the world will return to a state that it was before the fall of Adam and Eve. It was good and it was abundant. I've said it this way. I've said, if you want to experience pain, experience it right now, today. Go out and work out till you hurt, because you won't be able to later. You only can experience pain in this life. So that doesn't mean go hurt yourself. It means work hard. Work till you hurt. It's the only time you can. And we can look forward to that day without pain and without evil. Isaiah 65:25 says, "The wolf and the lamb will graze together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox, and the dust will be for the serpent. They will not do evil or harm in any holy mountain, says the Lord." Isaiah 2:4 says, "He will judge them between the nations and will render decisions for many people. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and spears into prune hooks. Nations will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war." I think this is so cool, because there's going to be other nations in the kingdom of God. There's going to be work to do in the kingdom. It says hammers into swords. They will hammer their swords into plowshares, meaning, like, they're going to switch from, like, war materials to materials that are used to eat, to cook, and that they won't learn war. So how does this connect to Bitcoin, right? Why even talk about all of these things like plowshares and pruning hooks and building our homes and the work involved? I think that prayer that we pray that on earth as it is in heaven, that we can have that today. We can bring that part of heaven here because Bitcoin can fix some things, right? It can't fix everything, but like for instance, it doesn't fix a lost soul. It doesn't fix a broken heart. Bitcoin can't make a sinner not a sinner anymore. Bitcoin can't forgive you, okay? But what it allows us to do is to start looking through to a prosperous world, to have a money that is finite, that doesn't change in units, is to say that we are not going to steal from one another. It's a way for us to start building a foundation of our life and for our kids' kids that ultimately preaches the gospel in a way that really our money today doesn't. And I think that's what gold did back in the day. It taught people principles. It taught people saving. Silver, same way. I don't know if it was more valuable or less valuable back then, but it seems like it would be a little bit less. It's a way for people to start gaining an understanding of a finite money and a foundation on a reality that is built in our world, in our physical realm. Like we can't mine more Bitcoin faster, no matter how many machines we plug in. We can't change the code because you'd have to change every single computer on Earth. Like these things allow for a foundation to be built so that you can start to see what the kingdom will look like. We won't be able to steal from each other in the kingdom of heaven. It says right here, they won't learn war. And there is no sin. And so is that to say that, if you use Bitcoin, you won't sin? No, I just said that. It doesn't make a sinner not a sinner anymore. Only Christ can do this. But the foundation and the wisdom that Bitcoin can allow us to have is one that you can begin to establish as a standard in your life. Once you have that standard of the realness of money and not just like what I'm told by the government or what I'm told by the news or what I'm told by the Federal Reserve, you can almost go backwards in time, and you can build your life again. You can start to save in an asset that doesn't have unlimited supply. It starts to put a limitation on what money does. It starts to put a limitation on who controls the money. And that alone, right, can allow us to be more generous. It can allow us to have more time. And it's hard to understand that by just me talking about it. What really has to happen is you have to do the work to understand that. You have to save in it yourself. You have to run the code yourself. You have to see that for yourself. So it's my prayer that you go back and maybe re-listen to prior weeks that we've done. Maybe if that isn't enough, go deeper and listen to the podcasts that Bitcoin in the Bible and the three guys that sat down to record it did. They do such a good job. I can only recap this as an understanding of the reality of the Bible and the reality of Bitcoin. But you have to experience that for yourself. So that's my prayer, is that you start today. Go make a follower of Christ. Go do something that you haven't done before. Go start that new adventure, because you only get today, and tomorrow is not promised.